would say to act with compassion is a kindness, is a positive thing that you could be doing, and that would improve the state of the world if more people were compassionate. And that's one of the things that I teach with mindfulness, right? Is one of the benefits of practicing mindfulness yourself is that you are contributing to a more mindful and caring world if you are compassionate towards others, right? Using that construct of mirroring that you were talking about, the world will reflect compassion back to me.
Hey folks, Sean here. Welcome to Finding Fuscata. If you're new to the channel, welcome. In this here channel, we talk about, what do we talk about? We talk about metaphysics and spirituality and psychology and self-improvement and pretty much anything that falls in that realm. And the guests I have are psychologists and coaches, and hoping to have some physicists and other spiritual and thought leaders. And it's just a great channel. So if this is your first time here, welcome. I'm glad you're here. If you're returning, welcome back. I think you're really, really going to like the show today. Today's guest is, it's really bright outside. Today's guest is Dr. Alice Rizzi. She's a psychologist out of Brooklyn, New York. And she's, good thing to note, she's licensed in both New York and Florida for telehealth, which is interesting because I have a feeling that by the end of this interview, you're going to want to reach out to her, especially if you have some of the things that she specializes in. And speaking of what she specializes in, I had to write it down. So I got my handy dandy notebook. Check this out. She specializes in anxiety and stress, mindfulness and meditation, OCD, up-leveling, which is, we didn't talk about this, but if you look at it on her website, up-leveling is basically, it's kind of what you would think it is. Like if you feel like you've kind of reached a glass ceiling in your career and your life and you like to take things to the next level, she will help you through therapy sessions find whatever your blocks are and help remove them so you can up-level, which is cool. She also offers cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, and exposure and response prevention. That's a lot of stuff. And I think that you will find her as warm and welcoming and intelligent and engaging as I did, and I hope you really enjoy the conversation. Hey guys, one thought before we get started is just a word about mental health. Please, if you're having any thoughts about SI, or if you're just like in a dark place or you feel like you need help, please don't hesitate to reach out. Dr. Rizzi has great resources. There's a bunch of resources in the show notes that you can reach out for, and especially to my veteran brothers and sisters out there. I haven't talked about it on the channel, but I've had significant struggles with PTSD and SI. Oh, the wind's taking my umbrella. I've even been hospitalized for it, but I made it through, and I got therapy, and I got the medication right, and I worked with the VA and psychologists and psychiatrists and therapists, and I did the work and I got better. And you can too. So I just want to say that if you are struggling with that stuff, please don't hesitate to reach out. It's way more important to get help than to risk just suffering alone. And one thing that I learned in my own struggle is that the stigma of mental health needs to go away. Because if somebody has a broken arm or a broken leg or, I don't know, diabetes or something like that, you know, we don't make fun of them. We don't ostracize them. We get them help. And the more we learn about the brain and brain chemistry and life and how complicated things can be, the more we learn that sometimes there's just something wrong with your brain, or sometimes there's just something wrong with your life, and sometimes you just need some help. And it's no different than going to get a cast on your arm or your leg or getting insulin or whatever it is that you got to do. So I did it. It worked for me. I would highly encourage you to go do it if you need it. So without further ado, Alice Rizzi, Dr. Alice Rizzi. How are you, Alice?
I'm good, Thanks. I just wanted to confirm we're aiming for about an hour today, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Yeah, no, I'm well, Sean. How are you?
Good. It's been this last week has been really hard for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, just because like everything with going on with Trump and
Mm,
Biden and like for some reason the thing that got me most about this whole situation, well, there are two things that hit me hard with the situation. One is that I have a son who's 20 years old.
hmm
He and I had a falling out a couple of years ago. And I keep, I reach out and I talk to my daughter who's still close with them. I talk to my other son who's still close with them, so I get like information, like I know what's going on in his life.
hmm
But he and I, he's like, how do you describe it? It's like, you've probably seen this a lot before where some people they get, and I know I was like this when I went so far down the political right. I thought anybody that was like left of me was just like a complete psychopath and a nut job and probably needed to die. But then as I came back towards the middle, I'm like, oh, we're all just humans and struggling with our
mm,
own things, and it's probably okay. Well, he kind of went in the other direction. He went so completely far politically left that everybody who's like a little bit right of him is a complete psychopath and probably
hmm
needs to die. And part of me is like, he's in that phase of his life, and I gotta let him go and experiment. And as long as, what I told him when we had the big falling out was, I said, listen, man, if you want to block me and go through this, then so be it. When you're ready to come back and have a conversation, then my heart, my arms, and my home are always open to you. No questions asked. Like I'll be here whenever you're ready. And he was like, fuck you, dad. I'm like, okay, but you know, go do what you gotta do.
Yeah, that's hard.
But it's still like, but he's that same age,
Mm,
as what's the I always forget Thomas Crooks. And the thing that got me is like, I can't imagine what Mr. Crooks is senior, what this kid's dad is going through and his mom, because by all appearances from what's coming out, like they had no idea that their son was, struggling with this stuff, that was going down these dark roads. Like they didn't know.
hmm
And, you know, like you think your son's going to the shooting range one day to go
mm,
get some target practice. And then you get a phone call that evening that he's dead because he tried to shoot Donald Trump. And
mm,
it's like, but the thing that bothers me is that I don't hear anybody talking about that. I don't hear anybody on the news. It's all like we're just like vilifying and pointing fingers left and right, and it's somebody else's fault. And I haven't heard anybody stop and say, even among like spiritual leaders, and like all these different communities where nobody's like, hey, there's a mom and a dad that just lost their
mm.
son.
Yeah.
And we live in a profoundly sick culture that like leads this kind of thing to happen. And
hmm
anyway, I took a moment last night, because I do like a weekly, just like Sean vents kind of thing, and I recorded a podcast just about
hmm
that same idea that like we need to remember these people. We
Yeah.
need to know that we can't just vilify Thomas Crooks. you
Well, I
know
like what you said earlier about how, like, after going extreme one way, you found yourself centering back in the middle. And what I like about being able to be in the middle is that, like, you're able to take perspective and you're able to empathize and you're able to put
mm,
yourself in the other person's shoes, even if you don't necessarily agree with them.
mm,
And that's something I talk a lot about with my clients. Like, we talk about validating emotions. And when
mm,
you validate how somebody is feeling, all you're just saying is, I can understand how you're feeling this way from
mm,
your perspective, like with your beliefs, with the situation, given your thoughts. I can understand how you would feel that way. And
mm.
when I say that, that doesn't mean that I agree with everything that you're saying. It doesn't mean that we're like on the same side, so to speak. It just means that as a human being, I can understand those emotions that you're telling me
Mm.
you're feeling. And that sounds really challenging.
It is that's one thing that they drilled into us in the Air Force. So
Mm.
I did 23 years in the Air
Mm-hmm.
Force, and I've been through a lot of management and team building and leadership classes, and like all these kind of advanced ideas. And one of the through lines through all that stuff is you have to be able to do a paradigm shift,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the military, because you never know who is going to come work for you, and you never know
Mm-hmm.
who you're going to go work for,
Mm-hmm.
because it's people from all different ethnicities, age groups, genders, sexual orientations, geographic locations. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's a melting pot hodgepodge of America, and by extension the world.
And you're never
And
going to agree on everything,
you're
and
no,
you're always going to disagree on something. So it's how are
exactly.
you going to handle those moments?
Right. And the big problem you have in the military too is, since it's such a self-selective group of people, and it's military oriented, and people like guns and uniforms and big, it's very testosterone kind of environment. When somebody comes along and there's a disagreement, there's an easy tendency to want to rule with whoever has the bigger fist. But you can't, you obviously
Mm-hmm.
can't do that, and but doing those paradigm shifts was really, really helpful for me, especially coming out of my background as a fundamentalist Christian, and like a diehard Republican. Like, I was bonkers back in the day, but little by slowly, like I had a guy that I had to supervise who was very, very gay, and just not shy about it. And I was still born again Christian, and this guy comes in, and I'm like, I don't know what to do,
Mm-hmm.
but forcing myself to do that paradigm shift, and forcing myself to get to know him, and like listening to his
Mm-hmm.
stories and listening to his life, I was like, oh, he's just a dude
I
who
mean, that's the biggest thing, right? Is like
yeah.
we're afraid of what we don't understand. So
Hmm.
if that's something that you haven't been exposed to before, it's unfamiliar, it seems strange or weird. And when you get to know the person behind like the thing that you don't understand, it's like, yeah, we're all just human. Like they
Yeah.
have thoughts, they have feelings.
Yeah.
So like, yeah, of course we like find it more relatable. And then it's like, yeah, we can just get along.
Yeah. Yeah. And I found too that there's just so much more beauty in the world.
Mm.
There's some
Well, and then
people
it's
are
complex, that people are complex. Like
yeah.
so many people, like we put people in boxes, right? And we try to
Hmm.
categorize them like you're this or you're that. And we put those labels because that makes it easy for the brain to like process information and make decisions.
Hmm.
But it takes away like the beautiful complexity of we
Hmm.
are all different and we have so many layers. And just because you might not understand or relate to this one part of this human, like that
Yeah.
doesn't mean that you're not going to be able to understand like the other 98% of them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that oh shoot, there was something there I was gonna say. It was good. I forgot, it slipped out of my head. But it just brings so much more joy to life, and uh fellowship. That's
Mm,
one thing that I do miss about Christianity, is they there's a language there that brings people closer. Like they
mm,
people in the Christian world aren't shy about talking about fellowship. Like, we need fellowship. Like, we need to get together. Like, in the church that
mm,
I grew up in, we had a room that was called Fellowship Hall.
mm,
And it was just this big room where we had like, you know, um banquets and speeches and prayer meetings, and just like whatever needed to happen, and where people needed to get together, and it was just Fellowship Hall.
I mean, it sounds like community. And
It
I think that's
is.
why so many people are attracted to specific religions is because they want
Mm-hmm.
that like sense of community.
Yeah. And I think that I've been a vocal critic of the atheist movement, and a lot of secularism too, because that that's gone, and people don't talk about fellowship. Like, I wish that, like, in my town, is back in the day, was renowned for having a bar on every corner and a church on every other corner. It
Mm.
was just, and I think we're a very small town, but I think there's a dozen churches,
Hmm.
and these days most of them are empty, except we have a large Hispanic population. There's a lot of people from Brazil and Portugal, and for some reason, like those families came to my town, and so a lot of those folks, like the Catholic churches are active, and they have Spanish specific churches and Portuguese churches and stuff like that. But most folks just don't go, and a lot of the churches are just kind of like mothballed or have been converted
Mm.
into houses, or I think one's going to be converted into a nightclub or something like that. But the thing I do miss about church is being able to go someplace on Sunday, and like the old widow from town is there, and you can check on her and make sure that she's okay. And
Mm.
like when you're a kid, she'll like give you a lollipop or whatever.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And the church would do things like that, and that the government wasn't supposed to do, or it wasn't set up to do. But we could be there as people and get together
Hmm.
and build those kinds of communities.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what you're also touching on is the sense of connection that
Yeah.
we all crave, like community, like spirituality, religion, devotion, like they all help you feel a sense of connection either to your
Mhm.
fellow human beings or to something greater than you.
Yeah. And at the risk of speculating too much, to come back to the beginning of this part of the conversation, is one could argue that that's a big part of what Thomas Crooks was facing, and what led him down this path is there wasn't a community.
Well, that's what happens a
Well,
lot
and
with
I
these
know I
shootings.
know it's speculation. Sorry to cut
I
you off.
mean, a lot of
Yeah.
these people end up feeling disconnected,
Yeah.
disconnected from society, disconnected from family, disconnected from friends, disconnected from other groups.
Hmm.
And a lot of times it's like that sense of like loneliness. I am alone. Nobody understands me. Nobody gets me. What's the point?
Mm.
Or,
Yeah.
I mean, in some cases, it's I have so much allegiance and connection to this one group. I must protect them. I must keep them safe. So to some
Mm.
extent, they believe that what they're doing is for the greater good,
Hmm.
but it's misdirected, misguided, and they go about it in the totally wrong way
Mm. Yeah.
to keep that connection, right? Like just to sort of highlight how important connection is to humanity, is some people go to great extremes to protect those connections.
Mm. I had not looked at it that way. That's an interesting perspective. I like that.
Mm.
Yeah. Because yeah, that's one of those things that once you say it out loud, you're like, well, yeah, obviously. But until you say it out loud, it never crosses your mind. Because
Mm.
it's like air, like it's so obvious,
Well,
like,
and that's that perspective taking,
right?
right? Because like some people can like jump to conclusions and say, well, there's something wrong with him, right? Like
Yeah.
they're like morally, ethically, humanly, like this person isn't right or they're broken or whatever. But then you try to take perspective, right? And you're like, well, what must he have been going through? What were his thoughts? What were his
Mm,
emotions? What intentions was he acting on? And you might assume that it's to protect what he believed was the greater good.
mm. So
And that's not to make like excuses by any means,
no,
right?
yeah,
It's like my job is just to understand like the human perspectives that we all exhibit. And just be,
yeah.
again, it's coming back to that point of emotional validation. I can understand from that person's perspective why it is that
Hmm.
they were acting in the way that they were acting without by
Right.
any means agreeing with the
Yeah,
actions that they took,
yeah,
right?
absolutely, yeah. And that's a the way, tell me if I'm seeing this right, but I think that that takes a level of emotional maturity to be able to see, how do I say this? One thing that I talked about in the episode that I recorded last night was the difference between accountability and blame.
Mm-hmm.
So I in my own life, I'm practicing radical accountability.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been on the spiritual path of practicing that. And in my view, there's a sense in which anything that I see in the world, in some sense, I'm accountable for, even
Mm-hmm.
though I didn't do it. I'm not to blame for it,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a sense in which I have accountability. because of, you know, like you said, paradigms, or in, in spirituality, there's that idea of the mirror principle, uh,
Mm-hmm.
of the principle of correspondence. So like whatever you're seeing is getting filtered through your brain, and you interpret it
Mm-hmm.
in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And there's this Hawaiian practice called
Mm-hmm.
Ho'oponopono. Okay.
Mm-hmm. I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
So yeah. So when I think about that Ho'oponopono, and I think about what happened with Thomas Crooks, I'm like, ooh,
Mm.
maybe this is something that I need to do, because it's taking accountability without accepting the blame. Does it make sense? And
Well,
like
what
it's
is
the
it that you
same.
would be taking accountability for?
Yeah, well, that's the question. So, but just, and let me answer that, but like, just to tie it back to what you were saying real quick, is that you were saying there's a difference between understanding somebody's motivations and
Mm-hmm.
justifying somebody's motivations, and or
Well, like
like,
making excuses for it.
right, yeah, yeah. So there's like, they're totally different worlds, right?
Right.
But what
Right.
I'm saying is that when I kind of do the inverse of that,
Yeah.
there's a difference between blaming myself and saying, well, I'm responsible for this, and
Yeah.
then accepting accountability for the state of the world.
Right. I mean, I think you can ask yourself, like, what role do I have to play in this? And
Mm-hmm.
for example, like, if I want to change the state of the world, what can I change myself? Right.
Right.
Like in spirituality, we always talk about like you change yourself and the world changes.
Right.
Right. And we can't control what other people do, but we can control what we do. So if
Mm-hmm.
there is something in the world that you are seeing that you don't like, so for example, like a lack of peace, you can ask yourself, well, how can I contribute towards peace myself?
Mm-hmm.
So for me, like a small way to do that might be like a strong value of mine is kindness. How can I
Mm-hmm.
be kind today? How can I respond to this person in kindness? How can I understand and give them empathy or validate? Again, without necessarily always giving agreement.
Mm-hmm. Do you see a difference between niceness and kindness?
Yeah, absolutely. Funnily enough, I was just having that conversation with my husband over the weekend,
Really?
and we added in compassion as well, like the difference
Oh,
between nice versus kind versus compassionate.
okay.
So, compassionate, I do a lot of work with mindfulness. So, compassion to me is an integral part of mindfulness. And what compassion means is a desire to alleviate someone's suffering.
Mm-hmm.
So I might be compassionate towards someone by helping them prevent pain, avoid pain, get out of pain and suffering. To be kind is to act with like friendliness, is to treat somebody in a kind way, is to treat them as though they're a friend.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas nice to me is almost like it's a very arbitrary, showy, comparison-y type of construct to me. Like we are nice because we want to be perceived as nice. So to
Mm-hmm.
me, it's almost like it comes from like a fear of judgment or like preservation of your self-image. I want you to think
Mm-hmm.
that I'm nice versus you're observing me be kind or compassionate towards somebody where there is an action that I am taking versus just how
Mm-hmm.
you perceive me because that's the way that I present myself to you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I heard a comedian
Mm,
talk about it this way, that people on the West Coast are nice, but they're not kind.
mm,
And people on the
mm,
East Coast are kind, but they're not nice. So
hmm.
the
It's
story was like, if
interesting.
you're, yeah, if you're on the side, like if you get a flat tire right on the side of the road, people in California will be like, "Oh man, I'm so sorry, you got a flat tire, dude. That's like crazy, man.
But they won't help you
Okay,
change it.
have a good day." And they just leave you there. But like if you're in Jersey, somebody will pull over and be like, what is wrong with you?" While they're changing your
Yeah.
tire for you, you're like such an idiot. You don't take care of this, like blah blah blah, just like ripping the whole time. But then here you
Yeah.
go, get back on the road, because
Yeah.
they're not nice, but they're very, very kind.
Hmm.
And but I wonder too, like how compassion fits in there, because I get tripped over compassion sometimes, because I feel like compassion is like one of these neutral things that can be like, you can be compassionate and do damage.
Can you say more?
So if you so your definition of compassion was doing something to alleviate somebody else's stress or pain or something like that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think some people can misinterpret that. Like my daughter, for example, this morning she said she was hungry, and she's old enough now where I'm encouraging her to get her own breakfast and do
How
stuff like
old is
that.
she?
7.
Oh, okay.
And like a little bit of,
Yeah, yeah,
she can
yeah.
like scramble eggs in the microwave, and I have to, kind of clean up the mess before mom sees it.
Yeah, well, I wanted to clarify because 7 is very different from like 15.
Yeah, she's at the early stages of being able to, like, get herself a
Yeah,
bowl of
yeah.
cereal, and it's fine. So I encourage that. Well, I was exercising in the living room, like, my kettlebell swings and silly stuff like that, and she came back out with a lollipop,
Mhm.
and I'm like, babe, what are you doing? And she's like, you said I could get myself some breakfast. I'm like, dude, that's candy. You can't have, that's not. But
Uh-huh.
she got so mad at me, and she's like, but you
Mm.
said I could blah blah blah. I'm like, babe, come on, like, you're 7, like, you can make better choices than this, right?
She's trying to assert her independence.
Exactly. And so be it. Like, I would have
Yeah.
done the same thing. I would have tried that with my dad, see what I get away
Hmm.
with. But the thing is, I feel like some people can misinterpret compassion,
Hmm.
and then take their parenting too far into, like, the nice, I don't want to cause my child any distress or grief, by saying,
Hmm.
no, you can't have a lollipop for breakfast.
Right. I mean, I think a lot of parents, naturally so, want to avoid traumatizing their children, even like
Yeah,
in small ways, right? Like you want to
right,
be mindful of your reactions. Like, you're not gonna like yell her and tear her apart for trying to get a lollipop, but you're also not necessarily gonna say, yeah, sure, eat lollipops for breakfast. So it's that
right.
like healthy balance. And to me, compassion is the way that you approach that situation, because compassion, like, again, yeah, it's the desire to alleviate somebody else's suffering. And there might be, like, I always talk about having compassionate boundaries, having respectful boundaries, having kind boundaries, because a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people think it's not nice to set a boundary, but actually
Mm.
setting a boundary can be the most compassionate and kind thing that you can do. So, like,
Yeah,
telling your daughter in a respectful way that, respects her autonomy to a degree, like, no, honey, you can't have a lollipop for breakfast. That's not good for your health. And I want to make sure that you're
right.
taking care of your health. How about we go for XYZ instead? So
Mm-hmm.
you're showing her a boundary. You're saying, like, no, that's not okay. But you're doing it in a way that like, she's 7 years old, but she's still a human. So you are respecting her humanness at this
Yeah.
age.
So it's almost like, so what I'm hearing then is that compassion by itself is just neutral. It's like air, right? It's just a method that you can use, but it's completely neutral in itself. But compassion with niceness can be detrimental, whereas compassion with kindness can be beneficial. You think that's fair?
I don't know. I haven't thought of it in that way
Yeah.
necessarily, like, because I don't even necessarily know that I would say that compassion is neutral. I can't say that it's not.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't studied compassion to that extent. I'm not sure what like compassion researchers like Sharon Salzberg might say. She's very big in the field of compassion. So I don't know if she would say that it's neutral or not. I would say that it's on the side, like, it would, for me, it would be on the side of positive, like a positive
Mm.
action that you're taking. And I would say, like, the majority of people, or okay, maybe that's not fair. Some people lack compassion, right? They lack the
Mm-hmm.
desire to help other people suffering. They're apathetic, right? They're so
Mm-hmm.
too consumed with themselves, their own egos, how they are showing up as themselves, what they are getting, in order to care about other people and their suffering. I mean, this is why
Mm.
perspective taking and empathy are so important. So I would say to act with compassion would is a kindness, is a positive thing that you could be doing, and that would improve the state of the world if more people
Mm.
were compassionate. And that's one
Mm.
of the things that I teach with mindfulness, right? Is one of the benefits of practicing mindfulness yourself is that you are contributing to a more mindful and caring world. If you are compassionate towards others, right? Using that construct of mirroring that you were talking about, the world will reflect compassion back to me.
Mm-hmm. I like that a lot. So, so we kind of like dove into this whole conversation. We never did like an intro or anything like that. I'm notorious for that, but I don't mind because I love conversations. But tell me, so you keep bringing up mindfulness. Tell me about the work
Mhm.
that you're doing specifically. Like you're focused on that. You're a
Yeah.
psychologist. You're like,
Hmm.
this isn't like a fly by night thing for you. Like
Right.
this is serious work for you. Tell me about what you've got going on.
Yeah, well, I guess I can introduce myself to your listeners who have no idea who I am. I'm a New York licensed psychologist, so I have a therapy private practice where I meet one-on-one with professionals who are stressed, anxious, and who have OCD. That's my like niche in my private practice in New York. And then I'm also a mindfulness coach and course creator. So I'm a big advocate of practicing mindfulness, meditation, and values-based living. And so a lot of the resources I provide educate people on what does mindfulness look like in day-to-day life? How can you be a more mindful individual? And my belief is that more mindful individuals create more mindful societies that are more
Mm,
peaceful, more loving, more understanding. That's like my big vision is that if I can get everybody to practice mindfulness, then 50 years from now, 100 years from now, we're going to have a way more mindful society, which would inherently be like higher emotional maturity, right? Like
mhm.
higher emotional intelligence, where more people are able to be empathetic, kind, respectful, peaceful for the greater good. But it all starts with an individual practice because you can't control what other people can do, but you can control what you do.
So when I think of mindfulness, going back to talking about my daughter a little bit, when I am encouraging her to practice mindfulness, I try to do it sort of in everything that she does. So
Mm-hmm.
like a good example is again breakfast this morning.
Mm-hmm.
So she ended up getting herself a bowl of cereal, and it was Lucky Charms, which I wasn't thrilled with, but I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
okay,
Maybe better than a
it's
lollipop.
better than a lollipop.
Yeah.
So we can work with that. I'll make you some scrambled eggs later. I'll be fine. But I went into the kitchen to grab something, and she had just like left. Like the milk jug was out, and she'd splashed milk around, and there was trash, and there was a spoon, and there was stuff splashed on the floor, and I'm like, okay, so she needs more like direct supervision than I thought she did. We weren't quite that far down the road, but it's fine. But also I'm like, all right, we gotta get this cleaned up before mom comes down, or else she's gonna have
Mm-hmm.
a conflict with my parenting style, which is a little more hands off than she likes, but it's fine. So I had Quinny come out and had her like grab the sponge and clean stuff up. But the thing is, like, she just like grabbed the sponge and started slapping it around. And I'm like, no, 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 you gotta let's get a little bit damp and you gotta wipe it just this way. And
Mm-hmm.
then when you're done, you gotta, rinse it off and put it back in the thing where it belongs. And, but like helping her to be mindful through every step of the process instead of just like, just just leaving the mess and just
Yeah.
being completely oblivious that that's what happened,
Mm-hmm.
but then also being mindful of each step of how to clean up the mess and why it's important to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like
And
why is this the thing that you do?
right, yeah, and like showing her the difference between using a dry sponge and using a damp
Yeah.
sponge. Like it's counterintuitive, but like I remember my stepmom like flipped out on me one time because I grabbed a dry sponge and I was trying to clean something up, and she was just like, wah. But in
Mm.
fairness to her, she was very, very stressed out about a lot of other stuff. And I was not a fun child to have around all the time. But
Mm.
anyway, that's a different story. Uh, but helping her to be mindful, and I feel like the work that you're trying to do though is very similar to what I'm trying to instill in Quinn of just basic mindfulness in every moment, even with the
Mm-hmm.
simplest things like rinsing out the sponge when you're done wiping down the counter and putting it back where it belongs, and
Mm-hmm.
putting the cap back. But it seems like that could easily trip into OCD.
What do you
So
mean?
like for me, mindfulness is making sure you put the milk back where it belongs, and like the handle is facing out so it's easier for the next person to get out just right, and kind of cleaning things up. And but it seems like somebody could that could slip into OCD where like, the milk has to be like right here and you have to like measure it. It's got to be like a centimeter away.
So, Sean,
You know what I
that
mean?
goes into a little bit how OCD is portrayed on television, which isn't
Okay.
necessarily what OCD actually is.
Oh, okay.
And so maybe it's even helpful to go through like both mindfulness and OCD just for the sake, of this conversation. But like mindfulness is being present in this moment, right? Like
Okay.
with awareness, with acceptance, with kindness, with compassion, with curiosity, with non-judgment. And I know this is something that you and I spoke about off air, so I'm just repeating it
Yeah,
now for the sake of the listeners. That's my
sure.
definition of mindfulness. It's really being present in this moment with those other qualities. And so, what you're talking about is teaching your daughter, like, in this moment, this is what we're going to do because XYZ. Like, that might help set us up for the next moment. Like, when mom needs to get the milk, she knows where to find it.
Mhm.
But you're just making your daughter conscious of this is what we're doing in this moment. And a big part of like daily mindfulness is being with one task at a time. That's how you are mindful. So for example, if I'm taking a sip of water, I'm just taking a sip of water. If I'm doing the dishes, I'm just doing the dishes versus like trying to quote multitask where I'm doing a million different things all at once and I'm not really mindful with any of them. And that's
Mm,
actually less efficient, and we're more likely to make mistakes because we're scatterbrained, right? Like we're all over the place. We're not paying attention to one thing at a time. Mindfulness
mhm,
encourages us to pay attention to one thing at a time in this moment. What am I thinking in this moment? How am I feeling in this moment? What action do I want to take in this moment? So it's present moment awareness, acceptance, etc. So that's
okay.
mindfulness. OCD is an anxiety disorder. So OCD isn't something that you're going to get because of how you're taught to put milk somewhere. There's a lot of factors that cause OCD, like biological, chemical, neurological, situational. Like these are all contributors to why somebody has OCD. If you have mental health issues in your family, like genetically, DNA, like that's going to contribute to having something potentially. And it's
Mm,
not even specifically OCD. Like if your mother has OCD, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have OCD, but you might have a
mm,
different form of anxiety. You might have depression, you might have
mm,
schizophrenia or whatever it is. Like there's those types of genetic links.
mhm,
But OCD is an anxiety disorder, and it constitutes somebody noticing that their brain sent them an intrusive thought. This is a thought that they don't like, that they don't agree with necessarily. And because they notice this thought, they get a lot of anxiety. Why did I get this thought? What does it mean about me? Am I a bad person because I had this thought?
mhm,
And then there's an urge to do something to alleviate the anxiety. So, just as an
mm,
example, using what you said, I get the thought if the milk isn't just right, I'm going to kill my mom. Well, whoa, I'm not going to kill my mom. I don't want to do that. Let me move the milk to make it just right. Whew, I feel better. I move the milk. I'm not going to kill my mom. The anxiety gets lowered. And so there's this belief that starts forming. If the milk is just so, I help keep my mom safe. And it
mm,
reinforces the disorder. But the problem is every time that you act to try to alleviate the anxiety, it spreads just a little bit. So next time
mhm,
it might be I have the thought that if I don't brush my hair just right, something bad is going to happen to mom. So now
mm,
in addition to putting the milk just right, I have to brush my hair just right. And then I get to keep mom safe. And then it's, well, when I cook, I have to make sure that I wash the cucumbers first and then the tomatoes. And if I do it wrong, then something bad is going to happen to mom. I notice a lot of these thoughts are almost like in the voice of a child because a lot of these disorders start at a very young age. And so you're working
mm,
with the brain of like a 7-year-old, and these are the connections that the brain is making. So then
mhm,
when the person is an adult, it might look totally different. I have to proofread the email 25 times before I send it to my boss, or else something bad is going to happen.
mm,
But that might have started way back when basically the child learned my thoughts are dangerous and I have the magical power to keep people safe if I do this one thing. And if I do the thing just right, then my anxiety is lowered. But the truth is, your anxiety, whether it's high or low, has zero impact on the health of your mother, right? Or your
mm,
boss or whatever.
right.
but that's the nature of OCD. It's all in service of managing your own anxiety. And the compulsions that people do are in an effort to make them feel better because they feel so anxious about the thoughts that they just had. I know that was very lengthy, but
No, I
hopefully,
like that a lot.
like
That makes,
part
yeah,
of what
like,
I do, yeah, is just help people like clear up information about mental health and destigmatize. And the truth is, OCD is extremely misunderstood in the media.
yeah, that clear up a lot of things actually for me too, because you hear people throw it around like, oh, I've got
Yes.
OCD about this or that or the other. And
Yeah, it's very much a pet peeve. Like, oh, I'm so
yeah,
OCD. Like, no, no, you're
yeah.
not.
It's
Unless
like
you
for
have
me
a
when,
diagnosis of OCD, you are not so OCD.
yeah. Yeah, for me, it's like when people use the word whom the wrong way.
Yeah.
Gah! But
Yeah,
that's,
not also
that's,
not OCD.
I mean, that's just like the problem with being an English major, I guess, and a writer. Like you shouldn't have used whom right there. And please
There,
don't ever say irregardless to me.
yes, not a word that makes no sense. Um, but just to add maybe a little bit even more complexity into this conversation is that there's also something called obsessive compulsive personality disorder, or
Mm,
OCPD, which a lot of times is conflated with OCD in the media, and people kind of use them interchangeably because OCPD is where you often see people doing things in a really rigid way, and like they stack the books a certain way and they fix a pen that's out of place, and like again the milk has to be just right, but the motivation behind those actions are different than they are in OCD. With OCPD,
mm,
it's more of a rigidity and an inflexibility. They have these like their own self-imposed rules by what the world should look like. And like pens are meant to be neatly stacked on a table. The milk is supposed to be in the right door and not the left door of the fridge. And they
mm,
live by these rules, and they often hold other people to those rules as well. Like, no, you're putting the milk in the wrong place. It's supposed to be in the right place. That's
mm,
not out of like this whole cycle that we talked about where they have an intrusive thought, they get anxious about the thought, they need to prevent the bad thing from happening. This is based purely on their own like rule book of how the world should be, and it's more of like a preference in order to follow their own rule book. But
mm,
it can look the same if all you're seeing is like, well, my daughter placed the milk just right and she got stressed out if I did it wrong. You don't really know just by that action what is going on there.
mm-hmm.
And I think that's why it's so misunderstood as well, because certain actions can look the same. And so people label it the thing that they think that it is when they really don't know what's going on internally.
And wow. And but that seems like it'd be so subtle and nuanced too,
Mm-hmm.
because I mean, there's a big difference between being practical and conscientious and
Mm-hmm. Right. Right.
and having forethought and being mindful.
And that's why
And
there's a
then,
spectrum of anxiety,
right.
right? From like daily stressors and daily life. And like we all experience anxiety because anxiety is a human emotion. So whenever people come to me and they're like, Alice, I want to get rid of my anxiety, I'm like, no, I can't do that. Then
You're
you're
not gonna
not
do that.
human. You're
That's
not
a
going to
really
do
bad
that. Yeah.
idea.
But I can
Yeah,
help you manage your anxiety.
right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think because I used to want to get rid of my anxiety, and then I think it was, I know exactly who it was. I was talking to one of my therapists about it, and she said, well, if you get rid of your anxiety, then you'll probably get run over by a bus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. There's like
And I'm
a
like, oh yeah, that's
healthy,
kind of, I do need to have like a
yeah,
little bit of anxiety about going too close to the edge of a bridge.
yes.
Like I need to have that
Yeah. And it's the
emotionally.
same thing with that kids learn, like, I don't want to put my hand in the fire, or I don't want to touch the stove while it's on. Like,
Right.
that's a healthy level of anxiety that keeps you safe. It's
Do you
when the
know,
anxiety gets really high that it becomes problematic and where you need to learn how to manage it in a healthy way.
do you know Sam Harris?
Hmm.
So he has said that the difference between anxiety and I hope I'm quoting him correctly on this, but the way that I understand what he said is that the difference between anxiety and excitement is interpretation.
Yeah. Yeah, because the physical symptoms, if you will, are very similar. And
Right.
this is a concept that I teach most of my clients, because you might notice, oh, my cheeks are getting flushed, I'm starting to sweat, my fingers are tingly, my breath is getting shorter. And one
Mhm.
person might say, oh, that's anxiety, I'm afraid, I shouldn't do the thing. Somebody else might say, oh, I'm excited, let's go, I can't wait to do the thing.
Right. Yeah. That's how I feel about public speaking. Like if I
Mm.
see an auditorium full of people and there's a microphone and nobody's talking into it, I'm like, hold me back, bro. You know, I'm about like, there's something I can say to all these people. It's going to be amazing. But I just love that
Yeah.
feeling. I'm just like exhilaration. I want to get out there. I want to
Well,
get on
and it's the
and I want to,
adrenaline as well. And
yeah,
someone
I
else
want to go
might
to work
feel
that
that.
crowd. Yeah.
Yeah, and somebody else might feel that adrenaline and say, holy crap, I can't do that. You expect me to go out there and talk to all those people?
Right.
Uh-uh.
It's funny because my wife and I, she loves roller coasters.
Hmm.
And there's no amount of money in the world that'll get me on a roller coaster.
Yeah.
But I love speaking, like the bigger the crowd, the better. Like I love it. But you will not get my wife in front of a microphone. Like it just
Yeah.
won't happen, you know. But it's just interesting that we kind of have that yin yang of that excitement versus
Well, and it is
anxiety
all in
dichotomy.
the interpretation, because a big part of anxiety treatment is teaching you to tolerate those feelings, those sensations. And
Mm,
and mindfulness helps us with that as well. Like, right, again, back to what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What is my body
mm,
doing? And by the way, like as soon as you start like noticing it, putting a label on it, that already gives you a little bit of detachment. So for example, it's not I'm anxious, it's I notice my brain is sending me a lot of worry thoughts. I
mm,
notice my stomach it feels like it's doing flips. I notice that my breath is getting shorter. And even putting it in those exact words, like I notice, that gives you a little bit of distance and detachment from the experience itself. And
mm-hmm.
that automatically makes it a little bit less scary because it becomes more familiar, right? So we talked about how we're afraid of the unfamiliar. We don't like the unfamiliar or the strange. But if we can examine it, be curious about it, look at it in a mindful way, non-judgmentally, with compassion, it's like, oh, this is how my body is responding to this very natural thing. How
Yeah.
do I want to respond back? Rather than reacting automatically or mindlessly.
So, all right, see if this checks out. Another thing that I'm kind of picking up through this conversation is that a lot of it has to do with what your motivation is. So somebody may exhibit something that is stereotypically or in the media portrayed as OCD behavior, and fine. Some people may exhibit things that are, what was the other one? It's like obsessive compulsive.
OCPD, yeah, obsessive compulsive
OCPD.
personality disorder.
So they may see things that like OCPD, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or, but it sounds to me like if the motive behind those behaviors is anxiety versus if the motivation behind them is love. So
Mm-hmm.
if I'm acting in a way where I'm thinking about myself in the future, I'm
Mm-hmm.
projecting myself out into the future. And because I used to
Mm-hmm.
joke about this a lot, that I would say, man, I love past Sean because he always
Mm-hmm.
does such a good job of taking care of present Sean.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's inevitably something that I know I'm going to forget in a
Yeah.
minute.
So
But
Sean,
Sean 3 weeks
that
ago took care of me today.
that is compassion.
But yeah,
That
yeah,
is
it's
you
had,
are trying to alleviate your own potential future suffering. So you are
um,
doing things in a way that you know future Sean would appreciate. That is compassion.
so I'm having compassion for myself,
That, yeah,
not
because
but so both in the moment, but then also
correct.
for future self.
Yeah. And then you have compassion for past self and compassion
Oh, because
for past,
he didn't know what the heck was going on.
and he only did the best that he could.
Yeah. Interesting.
Like that's a way, a lot of times when people feel like guilty or ashamed of past behavior, we can apply principles of self-compassion and say, well, you were only doing the best that you could at the time with the resources that you had.
Oh
Can we
my
have
God. Yeah.
some compassion for that version of you? Because
Oh,
nobody wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to screw up my day today.
I mean, sometimes
Like, what can like, how many mistakes can I do
this is
today?
going
How
to be
can I
great.
piss somebody off today? Yeah.
Oh man. So this reminds me too of, so there's some work that I'm doing right now with a lady who does not really hypnosis therapy, but it's somewhere in that
Hmm.
realm where uh helping me to process some of my earliest childhood memories
Hmm.
and seeing how those things can affect, how my life is going today.
Hmm.
And I did an episode that actually I called it the heroicism of the infant.
Hmm.
And the idea was that, because this is something that she pointed out to me in one of the conversations that we had, is that in one of my earliest childhood memories, there was a scenario that's set up, and it I it set in motion a pattern in my life where my dominant limiting belief was that the thing that I want is always out of reach,
Hmm.
but it's available to other people.
Hmm. That's a really common one.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it's specifically denied to me. And the thing is, I remember the first time I felt like that. And the thing that came up in this conversation, her name's Whitney Riley. But the thing that came up in the conversation with Whitney is that she said, well, there's a sense in which that very, very young version of yourself who didn't have a lot of experience with the
Yeah.
world and didn't have the bandwidth to understand the full situation saw that this is how things go sometimes.
Hmm.
And then in order to be able to protect you and to keep you alive, then there are certain things that you just shouldn't approach.
Yeah.
There are certain risks that you should just never take
Yeah.
because they're going to end in death. Because if you think about like an infant or a toddler,
Hmm.
then anything that is an affront to the ego could literally mean death
Yeah.
in a very real
Well,
sense.
and that's exactly what we were talking about earlier in terms of like the brain likes to categorize and label things. And
Mm-hmm.
it is a self-protection mechanism. It's to keep yourself safe. Only a lot of times it's misguided, misinformed, or outdated.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and a lot of times basically what therapy does is it updates your system with new
Right.
rules, new guidelines, new ways of labeling information. Because especially as an adult, you realize that not everything is going to kill you.
Right. Yeah. And some risks are worth taking. But
Yes. Oh, before I forget, like just going back to something that you were talking about earlier in terms of like doing something out of anxiety versus out of love, that's very similar to actually how I phrase things for my clients. I change the language a little bit where I talk about we want to make more values-based decisions rather than emotion-driven one. Because emotion-driven actions are typically based in just this moment, which
mhm,
I can see how that would be confusing in terms of mindfulness, right? Because in
yeah.
mindfulness, we're paying attention to this present moment. But the thing to understand about emotions is that they are temporary. They go up, they come down. So, for
Mhm,
example, you need to understand that the anxiety that you feel before you speak to an auditorium full of people, that anxiety is temporary. And therefore, if it's a value of yours to get your message across, then you are able to tolerate that level of anxiety in service of
mhm,
that value. So you are essentially saying, yes, I accept this level of anxiety because it's important enough to me to get my message across to these people.
mhm.
Versus Sean going on a roller coaster, like going on a roller coaster might not really be values based for you at all. So you're like,
No.
yep, this makes me anxious. This doesn't make me happy. I'm not going to do it. And that's fine. But in some way, it's still in service of your values. It's just a matter of realizing what value do I want to be acting in line with. And why the mindfulness work is so important is because it helps you take that moment to pause to answer that question. Am I doing this purely because I'm anxious and I'm scared to do it? Or am I doing this because it's in line with my values? And ultimately, that's the kind of action that I want to take.
Then how does this tie into self-sabotage?
So in self-sabotage, a lot of times people are acting on those temporary emotions. Like if somebody has a goal. So let's say, for example, I want to do a TED Talk. And so part of doing a TED Talk is getting experience speaking publicly. But every time I get on stage, I feel anxious. And so then I'm like, well, this makes me anxious. I'm not going to do it. So I keep avoiding, I keep procrastinating. I might have a stomach ache. I call out sick. And it's like, that's the limiting belief that I can't do this. I'm going to die if I speak publicly. It's going to be so uncomfortable. And what like anxiety treatment or even like coaching with limiting beliefs can help you realize is actually I can tolerate that temporary sense of anxiety. And once I do it, I learned that I can feel anxious and I can do the thing anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how you learn to trust yourself and gain confidence and competence and mastery in doing those things that you're afraid of, and realizing that limiting beliefs don't have to be limiting, and you can actually reframe them and you can act in a values aligned way.
Mm. And we're coming up on an hour, which is crazy.
Mhm. Mhm.
But this all ties into it. It seems like the next time we talk, we should jump off into maybe worthiness, because
Big, big
it seems
topic.
like that's like the next logical
Yeah,
step. Like once
big
once you kind
topic.
of unpack all this, then it's like, okay, we got mindfulness. Now we understand your OCDs and this disorders and all this kind of stuff. And now we kind of got an idea of like how self-sabotage fits into it. But then if you really want to step further, then you need to step into worthiness, which is actually ultimately the a form of compassion towards your future self,
100%. Yes.
right?
And what you just described is often the trajectory that I see in my private practice. Is somebody comes in because like they're having panic attacks or the OCD is getting unmanageable and they
Mm-hmm.
can't like do whatever they need to do at work or at home. And so they come to see me like, Alice, help me with my anxiety, help me with my OCD, and like then I'll be good. And through the work, I teach them how to manage their anxiety. And after layers and layers, like they realize, oh, like this is a self-trust issue. This is a self-worth
Mm-hmm.
issue. What are my values? What kind of life do I want to live? What kind of person do I want to be? Am I worthy of that? And like that's the
Mm-hmm.
enoughness work.
Enoughness. I love that
But
word.
it sort of hides under the thing that is pressing and urgent right now, which is those sabotaging behaviors, right? So somebody might come
Mm-hmm.
see me because I have stage fright. So, okay, we will get at the stage fright. That will be the easy part of the work that they right now
Yeah.
think is the issue. And
Mm-hmm.
then later it turns out that like there's so much under.
Yeah. Yeah. So how would you like to wrap it up? What have you got, some like closing thoughts? Do you have any programs? Do you have?
Yeah, well, for sure. People, if you are interested in mindfulness meditation, values-based living, feel free to follow me on Instagram at Dr. Alice Rizzi. All of my mindfulness resources, I have tons of free resources. I have paid courses and programs and one-on-one work that people can sign up for. That's on togethermindful.com. And if you happen to be in New York or Florida, where I'm licensed as a telehealth psychologist, you can reach out at dralicerizzi.com.
Do you oh shoot. What's that website that people use these days? There's like you see advertisements on for all the time.
Psychology Today?
BetterHelp. BetterHelp.
Oh, what about it?
I don't know. I'm torn on that.
Against.
Yeah, I'm not. I had an
I'm a little bit
experience.
in the against bucket.
Yeah, I had an
Yeah.
not amazing experience with BetterHelp. I mean, I see what
Yeah.
they're doing, and I think
Yes.
it's worthwhile. But
And yeah, that's
I
why I
I've
can be
had
torn sometimes, because all of these websites, like I can see the benefit because they do help destigmatize mental health and seeking
yeah,
support. But I think the way in which they go about doing it is often counterproductive.
it's a little bit sus, as my daughter would say.
Yes.
And just to finish that plug though, I do think that Psychology Today, I have when I have needed to get mental health care or treatment or therapy, and I couldn't get it through the military or the VA. I the higher quality people that I found was when I went through the Psychology Today,
Mm.
and like they had that listing of folks. And
Yeah, so if I can throw in a few other resources for mental health,
yeah,
is a lot of
absolutely.
times people can get really overwhelmed by Psychology Today because they just have thousands and thousands and thousands of people.
Hmm.
So I think cross-referencing whoever you find on Psychology Today with like their own personal websites. So for example, my
Oh
Psychology Today
yeah,
profile has my website, and my website is going to have a lot more detailed information. So definitely checking out people's websites, seeing if it seems like a good fit. And sometimes you might have to go through several therapists. Like you might have to do a couple of first or second sessions before you find somebody that you
hmm
really click with. But
yeah,
if you can do that, like especially if you have the funds to do that, which I know is sometimes an issue, that it's going to be worth your time in the end.
Oh,
Because if you're
100%.
mismatched with a therapist, a lot of it can be a waste of time, a waste of money, a waste of energy. So you're better off doing a little bit of legwork in the beginning. So psychologytoday.com has tons of therapists. Another website, especially if people want to go through their insurance, is helloalma.com. That's
Hello, Alma.
HELLOALMA.com, because you can filter specifically by the kind of insurance that you have. And I've had
Oh,
a lot of people have success finding somebody who takes their insurance through Alma. And there's also a nonprofit organization that I really like where you can get fairly affordable services. And that one always escapes my mind, but I can look it up really quickly because I want your people to be able to find it if they need it.
while you're doing that, there's one that I use from time to time that is specifically for veterans and their families, and it's
Mm-hmm.
the Cohen Clinic, Cohen,
Mm-hmm.
out of Penn Medicine in Philadelphia,
Mm-hmm.
and they provide no cost treatment, psychiatric treatment, and psychological treatment, therapy for veterans and their spouses and children.
That's awesome.
And they're awesome. I've
Yeah.
worked with them several times. My wife has worked with them to get psychiatric care, and it's been fantastic. So for veterans out there, that's another excellent resource I highly recommend.
That's great. So the one that I was looking for is Open Path Collective. So Open Path is a nonprofit organization. You pay like a minimal registration fee. I want to say it's like around $50-$60. But then all the sessions that you're going to get with whatever therapist is going to be, I think the highest session might be like $100. Most sessions are like $50, $60, $70, which in this day and age is actually quite affordable relative to
that's amazing.
out-of-pocket costs. Yeah.
I another option. I was joking around with Whitney about this, is that like, since therapy is expensive, I just started a podcast.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
and I reach out to therapists and coaches,
started.
and I get a free 1 hour, 2 hour session. It's great.
And there's tons and tons of podcasts that have like therapists on them. And actually, because we spent some time talking about OCD today, OCD Stories is a really great podcast where you can listen to people and their OCD stories, and they get a lot of OCD specialists on there. And there's also the Stress and Anxiety Toolkit podcast, I believe.
Okay.
That's what it's called. And all things stress and anxiety, basically.
Oh, wow. I'm gonna give that one to my wife.
And of course there's tons of other ones, but and if anybody wants free mindfulness resources, I have those on my website, togethermindful.com.
Awesome. Then I'll have to have like a whole list of links and descriptions in the doobly-doo. I don't know if the kids still call
in the show notes.
Yeah, in the show notes. But anyway, so it's 11 o'clock. Man, that went by fast.
It did. Yeah. Sean, thank you so much for having me on. This was a really great in-depth conversation. I'm amazed actually at how many different things we got to.
Well, we covered a lot of ground. And we'll definitely have to do it again sometime, because I do think it would be important to jump off at worthiness. And because that seems like that's a whole big huge topic to unpack all on its own. So
for sure. And that's the deep inner work that I think at some point like a lot of people come to. But you need to have a certain level of like self-awareness and
very true,
just mindfulness to be able to do that kind of work.
Yeah, very, very true. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. It was good to see you again.
Thank you, Sean. You too.
All right, bye-bye. I was like, oh, the wind's taking my umbrella.